Hi everyone, welcome to this first episode of Oh My Malware. This is a channel where we grab malware samples and we run them on machines. Why do we do this? We want to know what coverage we would get if we're running the Elastic Defend integration, which is part of the wider Elastic security offering. You get it as default if you have an instance of Elastic Security running. So we're not going to be reverse engineering any samples here or doing any static analysis. We're literally going to grab samples from VirusTotal most of the time, download them, run them, and see the output. We'll also take a blue team approach to this, right? So what other tools and functionality does Elastic Security provide to be able to actually investigate any alerts which trigger? The sample we're going to take a look at today is by the Sofacy group, which is a very well-known group, sometimes known as APT28 as well. And this is a very well-known bit of malware. There's a lot of analysis done on it. There's a ton of different references about it. So I'm not going to go into any particular detail. I will be linking this specific VirusTotal link on the Oh My Malware website, so you can go ahead and check it out. And also, one of my favorite bits of content about this specific sample is by Unit 42 from Palo Alto. There's a lot of detail about what the sample does and a tremendous amount of information about it as well. So that's just an introduction about what we'll be looking at today. Why don't we go ahead and begin? So we have our instance of Elastic right here, and you can see we have two agents deployed. We're going to be running this malware sample simultaneously on two different machines to save some time, because I want you to get an idea of the different levels of protection you can get. One of the machines is running our Elastic agent with the Elastic Defend integration in what we say detection only mode, meaning it's only going to passively detect any activity from this sample. The second machine is going to run the exact same policy, but this time in prevention mode, meaning if there's an opportunity for the Elastic Defend integration to stop either the malware from running in the first place or any of the associated behaviors, it will go ahead and prevent those actions from running. Prevention mode is what most organizations would have running within their infrastructure, right? So you would want to stop bad activity from happening. Obviously, for the sake of this exercise, I'm going to do both, because we do want to see what we'd be able to detect, not just prevent. And the reason being is sometimes when you have a malware sample like this one, if it's detected as malware in the first place, right, as a malware portable executable, then you won't see anything else, which is great in a production context. That's exactly what you want to happen. However, here we have the opportunity to take a more dynamic analysis approach, where we do want to let that malware run to see what behaviors it might be triggering, right? Or what other techniques it might be trying to do. This is to give you an understanding of the breadth of capabilities here that Elastic is giving you. At the same time, again, so here we have our endpoints, but within our instance of Elastic Security, don't forget, we have 700 plus detection rules from a SIM perspective. So your traditional, what we call correlation rules, or whatever you want to call them these days, right? So these are all the rules that are provided. These are all developed in the open, if you're not aware of that. So we have a GitHub repository where these are all created. So we're going to see not only just from the endpoint side, what the endpoint is able to detect and prevent, but what other rules from a SIM perspective might get triggered as well, right? This is one of the benefits of having a SIM capability as part of endpoint. Call it XDR, call it whatever you want. This is a huge advantage right here. And again, nothing is custom. Everything is what you'd get out of the box if you had to go and create an Elastic cluster today. Literally, you could go do this right after the video and get the exact same capability that I'm about to show you. And with that being said, why don't we go ahead and start? Actually, before I run the sample, I'll just show you the policies real quick. So here's our detection only policy for the endpoint, which is running in detection only mode. So everything is set to detect. all the protections that are available. And obviously we're collecting all the different event types. And the second policy is pretty much identical, apart from the biggest difference being the prevention is enabled, right? So that's pretty key to having the different integrations here. Excellent. So those are our policies. Let's go ahead and trigger this. So here are my two machines, the detection mode machine right here and the prevention mode machine right here. This is the sample as it's downloaded from VirusTotal. I'm going to go ahead, extract, and run it. I've left it extracted, of course, because it might start triggering detections and preventions early, as these archives are encrypted, which of course we wouldn't be able to take a look at from an EDR perspective as they're encrypted. So let's go ahead and extract them. Okay. All right. So these are the files. And what I'm going to do is this, right? So I'm going to run the samples together. And then I will wait about 10, 15 minutes or so. So I'll cut the video there. And the reason being is this. First of all, malware can do a lot, right? So it has a lot of, it can have a lot of chain different events. So I do want to give it the opportunity to run in full. That's the first reason. And secondly, because our SIM rules, those correlation rules that we saw before, run on schedules, I do want to give those the opportunity to go through a cycle of the relevant schedules, right? From an endpoint perspective, detections and preventions will kick off pretty much in real time, right? As it's detecting those behaviors. So we will see potentially some banners pop up here as things start to happen. But yeah, we'll do that. We'll run them, wait 10 minutes, and then we'll come back. So I want to go ahead. This is an Excel file specifically, so I'm just going to give it the right extension. And then we'll go ahead. So this is detection. Actually, let's run it on both. Okay, and very common technique. And this is actually running a macro. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Do reference those articles from Unit 42 and others if you want to see what the macros do. But let's go ahead and enable to have actually run this. And you can see immediately behaviors start being detected from the endpoint and the Elastic Defend integration. We'll run this in the prevention one. And again, and this time we see a prevention alert, right? So I'm going to cut the video here for now. I'll come back in about 10 minutes of my time, and we'll see all the results within Elastic Security. Okay, so it's been about 9 minutes or so, and I'm pretty satisfied with the amount of alerts that came in. If more come in, so be it, as we're doing this investigation and examining the alerts that would have triggered. All right, so we got 11 alerts on our host in detection mode. I'm going to start looking at the detection host first. I filtered out the prevention here just so we can see the differences. So we had 11 alerts trigger, most of which are endpoint-based alerts. And then we do have a handful of SIM rules which picked up behaviors as well. Let's start off with the first one at the bottom here. Actually, before I do that, you'll notice that I added this secondary time column here on the right. This is actually showing the original time that the log was written or the event was picked up. And the timestamp on the left, this is the time that the alert was written to the alerts table, right? So either after the schedule ran or when the document made its way into Elastic. So just keep that in mind. This column is, or I should say this field, sorting by this field is much easier when going to an investigation because you get sort of an actual sequential view of what happened there. So suspicious Microsoft Office chat process. Let's take a look at what this is telling us. So again, this is a sim rule, right? So if you wanted to get more detail, you can actually click on the rule and you can see the whole rule definition. We provide all of this as Elastic by default out of the box, just so you can see the query, you can see our rationale behind the rule. Now, this rule in particular is looking for Office programs spawning a suspicious child process. And one of those child processes that we look for is actually certutil, a very common living of the land binary. And you can see in this alert reason and summary here, this is what's happened. It's saying, listen, administrator on your host in this particular directory started a process of certutil with these specific arguments via a parent process of Excel. We get to more detail here, so you can see exactly those arguments. We'll also see more recently, we've added this capability to see related by process instance tree. So all of these alerts are actually related. So that's pretty cool. Even before you stitch things together yourself, we take a look at the entire process tree and see which ones might be related. And then if you wish, most of our rules now have investigation guides, or I should say a couple of hundred of them have investigation guides. The team does an amazing job of keep adding more and more. Okay, so that's the first behavior we detected via a sim rule, right? So that's pretty cool. That's a first indication that something is pretty unusual. What else happened after that? So then we happened to get very similar suspicious certutil commands. Again, this is pretty much looking for certutil doing what it does. So if we look at the difference in the MITRE attack techniques, for the certutil command, we're specifically looking at the tactic of defense evasion with the technique of deobfuscate or decode files or information. So the reason actually certutil is used in these situations is, or this particular situation in particular, or specifically, this Excel sheet actually runs a macro that generates this text file, which is then used via certutil and decoded to the actual malicious binary. So it's literally doing that, defense evasion, because if we had to go ahead and use right out of Excel via the macro download this file, that sort of behavior has been picked up and looked at for a very long time. So at the time that this sample was written, using certutil for this sort of defense evasion technique was actually very popular and pretty strategic use of living off the land binaries. So we picked up that, again, that was a sim rule, and then here's our first endpoint behavior that was detected. So you can see these happened within a few milliseconds of each other, right? So the behavior on the endpoint was pretty much picked up immediately. Not going to look at that because it's exactly the same, just from an endpoint perspective. And then we had two malware alerts. And we actually do list the files here if you were looking at them. You'll also, when it comes to a malware alert, you might see that the malware picks up, I should say you get a similar alert for the same files, but it would be different behaviors. So for malware alerts, and specifically, what we do is we don't only look at when a malware is written to disk or executed. Any activity that happens with that specific malicious file is picked up as a malware alert. So if we look at this first one here, we had this malware detection alert. It was, again, this summary is really nice to identify why. So administrator on this host was detected creating a malicious file. So this was the creation of the malware file itself that we picked up via this malware detection alert. And then in the one right after it, let's see what that was. So this now was the execution of that file, right? So when Excel actually ran it. So we had the file write and then the file execution. That's why there were two. What else did we pick up? Then there was another sim rule for uncommon registry persistence change. Let's look at what that registry change actually was. So you can see a very common technique as well. This is a tactic of persistence. So, once a bit of malware manages to run, they'll try to establish persistence within an environment, so it stays present there. Very common way to do that on Windows is to modify registry key with a startup or a login script, which seems what this particular bit of malware did. And again, you get the process that did it, which was our malware file, and what registry key it changed. that's pretty cool to see. Again, that was a sim rule. Next up, we have, again, you'll see this a lot, right, as we go through these episodes. Most of the time, whenever you see a rule detected via, I should say, a sim rule trigger, you're probably going to see an endpoint style one in a similar fashion. With the advantage, of course, that all the endpoint ones have an associated protection. So we'll see now the difference in the prevention when we go and pivot to the prevention host, what that would look like. But I'm not going to go through this. This is exactly the same. We had a malware detection alert here. Let's look at that. Another one. And you can see here, actually, another malicious file was detected. So it's not the Q3C whatever process that was. This time, another file was created. Again, via that initial malicious binary with the parent, still the same parent process of Excel. We'll take a look to see how that happened later. And there were a couple more. So we have registry persistence. This is pretty similar to this one, right? So that's probably, let's just take a look for completeness sake. Yep, this is probably just, it detected the same events happening here. And then we had two more things. One is run DLL32 running with unusual arguments. Run DLL32, again, another very common living of the land binary. It's been used forever. So there's a lot of detections around run DLL32. Let's actually take a look at what those arguments were. Sorry, I went back. Magic mouse happy there. So this time, let's take a look at the table so we can see the process events. So we can see the process arguments here. Run DLL32 loaded up that cdnver.dll file that we saw being created. So we can actually see run DLL32 loading up a bit of malware, which is obviously never fun. And it's never fun to see run DLL32 doing this either. And the last thing we have is another malware alert. This time, probably what we picked up is that library being loaded. Yeah, you can see, yeah, we picked up the library, and it's probably during the actual load of that library. Yeah, so I filtered for event action here. You can see it was because we loaded up that image, or I should say the malware loaded up that image. So just to recap, we had 11 alerts trigger for one sample here. 3 of them were SIM rules, the rest were endpoint rules. Before we switch over to check what the difference is with the prevention policy, one thing I like to do is take a look at the event analyzer. I'm obviously very used to Kibana and Elastic Security, and in my head, I've pictured this all together already. But we do provide this analyze event view here, where you can see this graphically happening. So all that we just examined, you can see it happening from a process tree view with all the arguments and all the associated alerts. And another thing I'd say is one thing the team added recently was the ability to see related alerts by process ancestry. So pretty much all the alerts for that particular process tree are tied together for you. So even before we investigated each and every single one, we detected that they're all related. So obviously here we're running a sample in isolation. It's not part of a wider production environment. In a production ecosystem or sim like this one, you're going to have more alerts. Hopefully not that many, right? If you've tweaked your detections appropriately, you shouldn't have, thousands of alerts. But it's very normal that you're not going to have a very clean situation like me, right? So what we do is we tie all the related alerts together. So one sample, 11 alerts from a detection perspective. Pretty good coverage, I would say, for this specific bit of malware. One more tip I will give before we switch to this prevention host. You'll notice here that when we load up this analyze view, I keep making the same mistake with my magic mouse, I'm sorry. You'll notice that we load up the specific process tree depending on the analyzed process, right? So we only go up to the furthest ancestor of that process. we will not see any forks which might have happened. It's not the way this is designed. So one thing I like to do, just to get an idea of the full picture, I like to call it, I grab Excel and I search for that process, and then I'm able to see all the forks which might have spawned out of that particular process. So very easily, I open up timeline here, and I filter for process name. Excel. If I remember how to type today. And I'll filter specifically for that host, just to make sure we don't pick up anything from the prevention host. It doesn't really matter which one of these you pick, because when you open it up in timeline like this, it's gonna show you everything that process would have spawned, because we're not looking for a specific ancestry of that process. So I'm going to click on analyze event here, and now we should be able to see all the forks, right? Because if you remember, we had Excel launch certutil and do its thing, and then we see this other process launching as a child of Excel as well, because of what certutil ran. And this gives you a better picture when investigating these style of alerts. Don't forget, within this view, you get extremely advantageous other bits of telemetry that you can look at. So any file events, library, registry, all of that is highlighted here. So as an example, one thing we didn't talk about is the whole reason that run DLL32 is used here. This is actually used for the C2 communication. If you read that article by Unit 42, it highlights the actual payloads. So we can actually see that activity within the 17 network events here. So we can see some requests to google.com. This is a technique to just check that internet connectivity is actually possible. And then we see the actual C2 communication. And remember, because this is persisted, this is actually going to keep running. So you'll notice several, that's why there's 17. There's several instances of that being ran, because this is still running. I haven't actually terminated the malware there. So if we look at cdmverify.net, this is the C2 domain. It's still live. It's occasionally down if you follow the end of this, but no, it's at the moment it's still active, unfortunately. So we can see here it's making those requests, and then it makes TLS requests to try and connect. Okay, so again, recap this particular sample. We got 11 alerts, pretty good coverage. Why don't we go ahead and see what the difference is when we ran this in prevention mode. So I'll do the inverse. I'm going to filter out for this host, and then I'll take off the filter for this one. I must have not clicked the button there. No, I clicked it. So now when we ran things in prevention mode, it's a very different story, because this malware was actually prevented, or the behavior was prevented as soon as it detected that suspicious Microsoft Office child process behavior. So this is great, right? So if you're running this in production and prevention, nothing actually would have been able to happen, because we prevent that behavior from the start. We've still picked up those two similars, right? Because that that command was attempted, but then we killed it. So if you look at a prevention alert document, you will actually see a responses field here, and it tells you what we killed. So or what we prevented from running, I should say. So you can see here we prevented certutil.exe from running. It was successful. You can see the entity ID just to make sure it's the same one that we're looking at. So if you're not familiar, entity ID is a unique hash of that specific process, right? So this is unique to that specific parent-child as it ran at that point in time. Don't trust the PID for these things, because as we know, this is not unique, right? But we killed it successfully. So that's it. It stopped there. It couldn't run certutil to create that malware file. It couldn't use the malware file to generate the DLL. It couldn't use the DLL via run DLL2 to make the C2 communication. So we prevented everything from happening even before it had time to actually create any malware. We prevented the behavior, which is excellent. So with that, I think I will end the episode there. So remember, you will have access to this exact instance of Elastic Security to play around with all these alerts and data linked from the ohmymalware.com website. I'll link the sample again in the same fashion. And yeah, hopefully you get to see, even from this first episode and this first sample, how much Elastic offers out of the box, and even better, how much headache you can save when you have things running in prevention from the start. My name is James. Hope you enjoyed this first episode. Until next time.